Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the public who's attending. I am going to call the school committee to order at 3:31 p.m. First of all, I would like to welcome our candidate, Dr. Jill Geiser, who is here today. Jill, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your interest in the Belmont Public Schools. So thank you very much for that, and you're very welcome, and I hope so far you've had a great day in our district. I'm going to ask, I am Megan Moriarty, I am chair of the Belmont School Committee, and I'm going to ask that each school committee member please introduce themselves to the public and our candidate.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Checkway, school committee member. Have served on the school committee since 2019, and I'm really excited to have you here today.
Hi, I'm Jamal Sayeh. I'm also a school committee member, obviously. I've been serving here in this role for the past 2 years, and welcome to the district.
Thank you. Hello again, Dr. Geiser. My name is Jeff Liberty. I'm also a school committee member, a parent of 2 children in the system, and I've been on the school committee since April.
Welcome, Dr. Geiser. I'm Mike Crowley. I've been on the school committee since 2019, and I'm in my last couple of weeks.
Welcome, Dr. Geiser. My name's Kate Bowen, similar to Mike Crowley. Been on the school committee, however, since 2017.
And again, welcome to the public who are attending today. This is a school committee interview with our candidate. I will not be taking any public comment during this meeting. However, there is a public forum later this evening in which the public will be able to ask questions of the candidate. Before I begin, also, I would just like to thank Belmont Media Center again, who is here today, who is recording this meeting. The recording of this meeting will be available to the public after Friday when the final candidate has completed their interview and their public forum as well. So the way that today is going to work, Dr. Geiser, is that each school committee member has a question for you. So they will ask the question, and you will have some time to answer that question. 6 or 7 minutes would be perfect if you can make that fit. After you've replied to the question, a school committee member might have a quick follow-up or a quick probe, as long as time is permitting.
Great.
After that, again, if there's time permitting, if you have any questions for us, you can direct the questions to myself. I will either answer them or direct the question to another school committee member. Again, we'll just have to keep track of the time. And then at the end, I will give you about 2 to 3 minutes to make a little pitch, and at that point, I will close the meeting.
Great, thank you.
Great. So the first member who is going to ask a question is member Checkaway.
Sorry, I was just trying to close the door there. Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay. So increasingly successful organizations, including school districts, make systematic use of data to support problem solving and decision making. Can you please tell us about a time when you used data to inform a critical decision about educational programming and/or strategies?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And if you could speak directly into the mic so everyone could hear.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I feel like we're always pulling data into our work all the time, and when I think about the use of data, it's not just the academic achievement data. We also look at attendance data, discipline data, graduation rates. We also look at other kinds of data, such as surveys from families, surveys from staff. We survey staff on professional development. We survey them around our mentoring program. We survey families and I just sent out a survey about family communication with our district. So I will talk about a couple of areas where we use the data. One that I'm thinking about is really our program evaluation for Title I programming. So when I came to the district, I took that on. When I first came into the district, it was The large part of that program are interventionists and their work in the schools. We had the interventionists in the schools, but the services were not tailored as well as they could have been to the kids who were in need. Particularly, what I needed to do was first bring us more into compliance with using the rank order process around Title I. So in Title I, when you're identifying students for services, you do a rank order process, and through that you prioritize the students with a greater need. And those are the students that receive intervention services. So with that, when I do the program evaluation, I'm looking at the academic data, and we use iReady. And when I look at that academic data in iReady, I'm specifically looking at the growth that students who are receiving interventions make compared to those who are not. And so what we want to see is accelerated growth, right? So we want to, these are students behind in grade level, so what we want to do is see enough growth for them to get closer to grade level, if not on grade level. So that's the type of data that I look at to see about with that programming. So when I came in, it was about bringing in compliance, and then that data was not really showing us what we wanted to see. So that's why we went through and started to reorganize the work of our interventionists, and also in the past couple of years started to put more better curriculum in their hands. So for example, we brought in Zern for our interventionists to use with the students, which has helped a lot with regard to their learning. We also, in the same way, have used parent surveys to tell us more about how we need to be communicating with parents in a better way. Not just surveys, but also focus groups, the parent groups that I work with. So we get a lot of feedback from them about how they are feeling about school-home communication. And through that, we implement strategies in order to up that communication. Even from the district level, pushing out more frequent information. I've also relied on, I want to do more of this, but I've relied on some videos to get information out to the community. The other piece that we've started to work with staff on, with our principals on, and our leadership is around even at the staff level, like how do we make our communication with families more constructive, more about how we are servicing our kids. And so in that way, I was using the data to try to make programmatic improvements in those areas. And I was also thinking about, the mentoring program, same thing. So I run the mentoring program, and every year we survey the mentors and the mentees about their experience with the program. We're doing it right now, and we make adjustments to the program based on that feedback that we get. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, just one follow-up.
Sure.
Specifically about the parent conversations and focus group surveys you've mentioned. Can you say a bit more about what you learned from those data sources and what you did with the information?
Yes, so one of the issues that has come up in the past that was revealed there was parents sometimes not feeling like they're getting enough information about their child's progress and how they can help at home. That is a big area that we are looking at improving. One example where that we've taken to help with the help at home type of thing is in the area of math instruction. So we know math instruction, it can be with parents. Sometimes parents don't know how to help their kids in math. And so our math team over the past couple of years have run a math night on Zoom where they show families, parents, how the ways that kids are learning math in their classrooms. And they record it so that parents can watch it afterwards. That's an example of where we're trying to push out more content to parents around ways to help build their understanding about how the instruction or how the learning happens in the classroom so that they have a better understanding about how to support their kids at home.
In public school education, Meeting all educational needs is a challenge because of budget constraints. Please tell us about a time when you employed creative problem solving and financial management principles to strategically solve budget shortfalls.
Dr. Geiser, while you take a moment to think about that, we're having a little bit of a trouble hearing you, so when you do respond, could you just respond a little closer to the microphone, please?
Of course.
Thank you.
So could you just repeat it one more time?
Sure. In public school education, meeting all educational needs is a challenge because of budget constraints. Please tell us about a time when you employed creative public problem solving and financial management principles to strategically solve budget shortfalls.
So when there is one of the areas that I manage, one area that I manage are the federal grants for the district, the entitlement grants as well as ESSER money. The shortfalls there come in when I don't have enough more. I want more than what I have in order to address the needs. Right? It happens everywhere. I'll give you an example how I made a decision around a resource for that we brought in for students that I took into consideration the budget shortfall piece, the fact that I didn't have enough funds to be able to put it towards this. And it's actually a story I told students today. So this is in the area of mental health needs for students. A couple years ago, we brought in the resource of Interface, which is a mental health referral agency out of William James. And what that did was allowed families, students, and staff to be able to call the agency to make a connection with outside services of therapy or counseling. And so we were on a contract with that agency for a year, and it was the contract was in the area of like $13,000. It wasn't, it was certainly doable. It wasn't that much. And the call volume was very high because we were coming out of COVID. So it was, as with everywhere, that was a big need. We brought it in for that reason, though, because we knew that there was a need there in the area of mental health and social emotional learning. And so we wanted to offer that as a resource for our community. Throughout the year, the call volume was so high that when they were quoting us for another year's contract, it was jumping up to somewhere in the area of 50,000. So that was a big jump for us, and I wasn't sure that we would be in a position to be able to pay that much for that service. But yet, I knew that losing it would be challenging. The reason why I knew that is because we were getting feedback from counselors about how helpful it was. And when we said, what do you think about this service? They said, basically, whatever the service is, you can change the service, but don't take it away. Because for counselors who are already trying to connect students with service providers outside the district, that's hard right now because the demand is so high and there are not that many people that are available. So this service really helped them reach the needs of their students in terms of having a wider network to make connections and another resource to help do that. So as we were nearing the second year, and I was feeling worried because I was like, how do we make this work? Given that I putting that much into a contract like that would have been really challenging for us. I started to think about what are ways to maybe limit the contract, maybe bring the price down, and maybe we could have another model of, somewhat of a gatekeeper model where we had all referrals went through counselors where we could have some control over how many calls go through. The reason why we had to do that is because they charged by call. So they were charging us about $250 a call. When they gave us the quote, they were quoting us based on how many calls that they anticipated getting from us. So that's why that quote, which made sense in their pricing structure. As we were nearing that second year, though, we encountered another resource, which we didn't know was out there until my wellness coordinator said, hey, look at Care Solis. And we actually were looking at we had a couple different ideas on the table. And we being my wellness coordinator, my director of school counseling, and me, so we were having that conversation. And so he linked us with Caresolis. We talked with the rep, and essentially what it was there are two reasons why we went with this one was because they had a better service model. They had this was not only for students to access referral services, it was also for staff, it was for staff families, so they had a wider reach. But the other thing is their pricing structure was different. They were charging $4 a student, which means that contract was somewhere in the area of $19,000. So what that was if we had not had, we're lucky, I was glad we had that option because we could provide a better service. But in terms of like where the fund and the shortfall, we needed to keep that service in the district, and I knew we needed to keep it. But the how with the money was where we got stuck. And so fortunately, we encountered this as a solution. If we hadn't had that option, we would have tried to figure out a way, whether it's a shorter contract. We also talked about hiring a service provider as an employee of the district. That would have also been an option. So we were talking about other options to be able to provide the same service, but at a lower cost.
If I can just follow up, because sometimes the answer is look for other service provider, et cetera. Before you've identified that, and you mentioned that you were looking at other options, was there, were there any discussion, or how did you go about thinking about prioritizing potentially other needs, weighing out this need versus other needs in the district?
Yeah, absolutely. So this need was, I would say this need was a priority. We have had a high volume of kids in crisis that up until that point, our staff were just, they were doing the best they can, but we needed to provide those, students needed more than what we were able to provide. So it was a pretty high level of need. When I look at that versus, and the other thing too is, so the academic need was absolutely there, and we were funneling other resources towards the academic need. But it wasn't so much, it was prioritizing that as a need, but it was also looking at those funds that we had. So that 50,000 meant, and being able to spend the lower amount meant I could take that 30 grand and do it put it somewhere else. And that meant that could be, like we ran after school programming. So we used ESSER funds for after school programming. So some of it would have gone in there. We brought in interventionists both on the academic and the SEL side. Some of it would have gone in there. We provide summer programming. So part of the money where I can save somewhere else means I can put it in other areas, and academics is absolutely a priority where I was looking to as well. So we beefed up our summer programming and made it a little bit more tailored to, again, the students that were most in need. Did that answer?
Sure, thank you.
So the next question is something that I have personal experience with. The longer you are a leader, the more decisions you make. And sometimes those decisions are wrong. Please share with us a story about an important leadership decision in which you made the wrong call. Why did you make the decision you made? At what point did you realize you had made a mistake? And what did you do afterwards?
Okay, so I think the place where I have made wrong decisions is with hiring. Obviously we try to make the best hiring decisions as possible, but there was one time when I hired, it was an administrator, and when we put the search process through, or when we started the search process and they pulled the team together and they did the initial interviews. And so I was drawn to one particular candidate, And when I got feedback from the search committee, they were not as drawn to that candidate as I was. And there were a couple of other candidates also that we were looking at. I did not give enough credence to what that committee was telling me, and I went ahead and hired the person that I was more drawn to. It was not, in the end, a good fit. So what ended up happening was, with that, there were some challenges related to like relationships across the staff. There were challenges with relationships with families, and students as well. So eventually that person ended up leaving, but I was fielding a lot of difficult situations because I made the wrong hiring decision, and it was a lot of like it was big, right? It was I was feeling it a lot of what, you know, the fact that I made this decision, and what I should have done was listened more to the committee. I have very much learned since then. So that committee voice is very important in those decisions. So what I ended up doing, the one important piece to this is that I was giving throughout that time when that person was employed there, I was giving some critical feedback behind closed doors, but in the public, it was about being supportive. So that's one thing I was very conscious of making sure my public sort of communication is always about, you know, we're supportive, we're in this together, but I was giving critical feedback more in private because that's something obviously you don't bring out in public. When I had sort of some complaints that came in, I approached it by trying to work through it with them, listening, acknowledging where people were coming from. But again, where I was turning it into critical feedback in private. I think like my reflection is really about my decision-making process in there, and I learned a lot from that experience. And I think what ended up happening was in the end, certainly the healing happened from it, which I needed to help with the staff around that. But it was definitely something that was a tough. That was a place where I was like, I should have done something very clearly different.
So if I might just kind of follow up, what was it about this candidate that made you want to override the point of view of the hiring committee? And then what was the impact of this hire ultimately?
So the reason why I was drawn to this candidate, it had to do with how they were communicating about their work. I would say that this person interviewed very well, and that I sort of was, I guess, blinded by that a little bit, right? And so for some reason this time, like I couldn't see past that. Like, oh, the way that they were representing themselves. And so the general impact was there was ill will among the staff. And so that's why I mean the staff relationships were not great at that point. And so, and because the committee, like they knew that I had just I made a decision that maybe they weren't, you know, completely on board with. And so that's why I think at one point after the person left, and I was talking with a staff member who was on the committee, and I basically said, yeah, that probably wasn't a good hiring decision.
Thank you.
May I ask a quick follow-up on that one? You said that healing had to happen. Could you just speak a little bit about how you helped that healing happen amongst staff, whether that was your relationship with the staff or among the staff themselves, but what did you do to help that healing happen?
Yeah, so it's about conversations with the staff. I usually have to make a decision of, am I making this a staff-wide conversation, or is it more on an individual level? In this particular case, because we also have to balance sort of, you're not going to have a whole staff communication where you're criticizing a staff member, right? It's like, I don't do that. So in terms of making him heal, I think I opted for the more individual conversations, particularly there were some that were more impacted by others. And so more of that individual conversation and acknowledging that, the decision was not a good decision. It was a bad decision. So when they see you sort of acknowledge those things, that helps with them saying, okay, because I think that's the trust factor, right? If you say, okay, I did that wrong, then at least, because otherwise people don't know if, it helps people build trust in you that you can do the job, right? So it's sort of like, if without saying that, acknowledging where you make a mistake, people don't know whether you're able to see your mistakes. They don't know whether you're even able to avoid mistakes. So if they actually hear you acknowledge it, which I did with some people there, that helps build that trust. Was there another part to the question?
No, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, I think I have the next question here. On my list. Hopefully I have the right one. Student subject? Yeah, we're good? All right. Question I have here is, the Belmont School Committee hears from many families about the positive implications of serving more students with in-district programming and special education services. Please tell us about a time when you have led and evaluated program restructuring to better meet the needs of the population being served.
Yeah, that's great. Let's see. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing right now, because I've had a couple conversations around in-district programming today. So this one, we have had in-district programs in Billerica since before I got there. We have a program that currently serves students with ASD, students with language-based disabilities, behavioral programs, students with developmental delays. And the programs have been designed around the disability status. So and let's take Compass, for example. Compass is our program with students with ASD. So what has happened over time is that students get plugged into these categories. You're an ASD student, you go to Compass. Without acknowledgement, well, not without an acknowledgement, but not making a decision based on the fact that students often have multiple disabilities and complexity around their disabilities. So currently what we're doing is revising our in-district programming, and it's actually led by our interim special ed director, but I'm working closely with her as well to oversee this process. So the two principles on which we're resting this transformation or this transition or change has to do with that piece on how we look at students with disabilities. We want to go from assigning students to programs going from based on disability status to based on need. So we've renamed the programs, we've redesigned them so it's where you're saying, oh, this is what your services need to look like. So this is your placement that would best be served, that would best serve your needs according to your services. What that will do is make the programs more fluid. So you might have a student with, say, a language-based disability and a behavioral challenges that need more of a behavioral approach at first, and then when that starts to level off, then the language-based instruction they might be able to access that more. That's an example where you might take one approach and then have to switch gears once that need changes. So that also goes behind the philosophy of this. The other part of this is keeping the programs or duplicating the programs so that we can keep students in their home district as much as possible, their home school neighborhood as much as possible. Right now we do have a lot of students traveling across town for programs, so we want to try to decrease the number of students that need to travel to get to their programs. So that has been, it's been really eye-opening for me, and I know the conversation here in Belmont has been about building up some of the in-district programming, which is something I would look to do or look at as an option for us here. What I think about is with in-district programming is obviously the cost benefit of not relying quite so much on out-of-district placements for programming, but also keeping kids in their home district, attending school with their peers, has a really positive impact on their academics and their social emotional learning. So that is as important as the cost benefit. The one piece that, and I was talking about this earlier today, about bringing programs in. If you bring a program in, you can't just sort of plop it in the school and expect it to just sort of suddenly gel with the rest of the school. That school needs to embrace that program and every student in it with their higher level of need and make those students a part of their school community. That's that culture building in the school level. If you're going to bring programs in, you need that in order to really make them work. So that would be work with the leadership there. One example that happened in Billerica was when we had, a few years ago, 2019, we did a large transition of closing an elementary school, opening a brand new high school building, grade reconfiguration, and redistricting all in 1 year. So at that time, we moved the behavioral program that was at the elementary school that was closing and moved it to another elementary school. The principal there did amazing work with the staff around making sure that they saw every single child in that program going in the building as one of their own. And he worked hard at it because there were a few staff that were like, we're going to have these kids with higher level need, what are we going to do? And it's like, we're going to embrace them and we're going to bring them into our school community and we're going to educate them. That was his whole approach. That's how that should work. And so I bring that lens in when we're talking about building programs in general.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any follow-up for that?
I do, but if you have.
I don't. Go ahead.
Dr. Geiser, one question I wanted to ask you before when we were speaking about this example with the students was your view on how long it takes end-to-end to start a new program around special education in a district. You mentioned a lot of process steps, so I'm just curious, how long does that take in your view when done well?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. First, I would say if you're talking about, you would want to do one program at a time, right? You're not going to try to tackle this across different programs. The first step would be, if I were here, my first conversation would be with Mr. Kramer or with Mr. Libby, because I have a lot of questions about it. There's been conversation. Where is that conversation right now? That I don't know. What has been the barriers in the past to build the programs here? Because those are the things we need to think about when we're looking at this. What's the community's take on bringing in these programs? What's the staff perspective on it? Those are the questions I would first ask coming in. Based on those, so let's say we decide we're going to pull in a program and put it in a school, focusing on one area of need. Let's pretend it's like language-based disability. And so we start with where the space is. With this transition, as I understand it, would create, there seems to be a little bit more wiggle room for the space that we might be able to make that work. So where the space is, we have to think about the staffing. We have to think about staffing versus the number of students in the classroom and what that ratio looks like. And then when you're talking about building the actual programming, I would look to expertise, whether it was in district or out of district, to pull them in to advise on how to build that programming up, including curriculum and instructional methodology. I see that taking the better part of a year. visiting other programs, other districts with the same kind of program, understanding what the challenges are, and mapping out the rollout with all of the challenges in front of us to figure out, you know, what we're going to need to traverse in order to make it happen. If you're, in terms of a time frame, I think you could do the planning in a year, barring any, you know, snafus that might delay you, but that seems like it's a doable time frame. The other thing too is like you could implement low scale first year and then build it up. So you could actually, I mean, if you wanted to try a program with a limited number of students and then build it up from there, that might be another approach that we could take.
Thank you.
Hi. Building community partnerships among schools, educators, parents, school committees, unions, and other local government budget decision makers is vital to running a well-functioning public school system. Please tell us about a time when you fostered effective partnerships to create and accomplish goals. Specifically, what relationship building strategies did you employ?
There are several. I'm just thinking one that that stands out. Okay, yeah. So when in Billerica, before I referred to sort of upgrading our summer programming, and so this was a couple years ago, using our ESSER funds to increase programming for kids in the summer around academics. And one of the things I was thinking about was how, you know, I was thinking of it as an academic half-day program, and thinking about families that need full-day options. So I ended up connecting with our rec department, the director of our rec department, because my thought was if we can get a community partner to provide programming for the afternoon portion, that we could offer an optional full day for families throughout our summer program. So I ended up just working with the director in it. That first year, now it kind of runs, like we know what we're doing now, but it takes a couple years to get to that point. And that first year was multiple conversations, mapping out what it looks like in the morning, and when they take over, a lot of logistics, teasing through all the logistics to make it work. The key part of that relationship building is understanding, like I understand when there are certain barriers that they have that we have to adjust in order for them to make it work. So one example of that was a scheduling thing. So we were originally going to have it end at a certain time, like let's say 12:30. And at one point, the director came to me, he's like, my staff can't pick up your kids until 12:45. So I'm like, all right, we'll push everything back 15 minutes. I mean, it was not a hard thing for us to do, but it's definitely when you're talking about building the relationship, you have to understand what the other person's needs are, and to be able to say, okay, we can adjust based on your needs. And then also to say, you know what, I need this too. So like one of my needs was you need to prioritize our kids for your afternoon program, because they were also running a separate program as well. So I asked them to give priority to my kids for the afternoon component, and they did. So that's sort of an example of where I used a partnership to build programming that would benefit our students and families in the district.
Can you say a little bit more about how you would build partnerships with families directly in the community or in the district?
Yes, so directly with families, I'll talk a little bit about what I've been doing in Billerica in that area. When I first went into the district, there wasn't a lot of structures centrally at the district level around families and engaging families. So I had just come from a district in Somerville that had a very robust family engagement center called the Somerville Family Learning Collaborative. So that was sort of my lens that I was going in with. And so what I started to do is I started with pulling together a staff committee. That was like my first year. And we talked a lot about, I learned a lot from them about what the needs of the families are and what they are looking by way of family communication and relationship building with schools. So then what we ended up doing was we decided we needed to pull parents into the conversation, but we were trying to figure out how, like what's the structure that we wanted to use for that. And what the way we decided to do that was working with all of the PTO leaders, so the PTO officers, and pulling them into a sort of a centralized meeting or meeting space for them, with the goal of first creating that network with them so that they can have opportunity to share ideas, to troubleshoot challenges that they were all experiencing in their schools, and just general support for them as family leaders, as parent leaders in their trying to support their schools and doing that work. So over time, we've built that up, and now when we meet, there's a lot of sharing that goes on, but we also get feedback from them around what they're hearing by way of other parents and their needs and what they're thinking about. When COVID hit, we still met a little bit. We were also doing our reopening group, so this particular PTO group, we took a hiatus, but then when we came back around, we were meeting on Zoom, and a lot of COVID conversations were happening, which was helpful. Then when we came back in person, it was turned towards other kinds of areas. Like one area was transition, like kids that transition from elementary to middle and middle to high school. So we were getting feedback from them on that. And most of that feedback was, here's how we need communication from schools in that area. And so we adjusted our communication around what that transition looks like. I also used this group recently to get feedback on the survey that I sent out. So I gave it to them. It's like, it helped me to adjust how we were asking those questions. Our next steps are more around, we actually have this in our strategic plan, professional development, working with staff around how do you communicate with families, but it's not just a general communication, but it's also, some of it's how to have difficult conversations, how to help parents understand what's happening with their kids in school. Those kinds of things are the areas that for our professional development, that we would be looking at.
Thank you. May I quickly just ask one more?
Yeah.
If you were superintendent of Belmont Public Schools, what would you do to form partnership or relationship with the school committee?
Oh, that's a good question, because you're all sitting in front of me. So,
it's not always that easy.
So, I would absolutely, this would be part of my entry planning to begin. I'm talking with everyone. I'm talking with each of you individually, and I'm asking the same questions of like, what's strong here? What do we keep? What do we need to look to improve? My assumption is obviously that you're talking from the perspective as a committee member representing, the community, and then, things around like what are the how do I say, like red flags? Like what are the things I need to be on the lookout for in terms of barriers and challenges that I might not currently be seeing? So those are some of the questions I would ask each of you to start. And what your priorities are for the district. I get a sense of it, but to have that one-on-one conversation will be critical for that. Being communicative with you is absolutely critical. So if you feel like you weren't getting the kind of information from me that you need, I would want to know that so that I can get you the information that you need. One example of that I did in my own district was just a simple thing of when I was at a meeting and I was doing a presentation, I think the MCAS presentation, and one of the school committee members asked, because we started talking about curriculum development, and I guess they'd been hearing like, we don't work on our curriculum, we don't improve it, we don't do anything with it kind of thing. And he said, is that true? It's like, absolutely not. We do all kinds of curriculum development. We're always updating it and so forth. Can you bring that information to us at a future meeting? And the next meeting I had a 3-page memo of like, here's all the stuff that we've been doing over the past like 5 or 6 years. That's what I'm talking about. Like, if there is something that the information that you're looking for, I would want to make sure that you have what you need around that. And just being responsive to questions and things like that. Does that help answer?
It does. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
In Belmont, we're often challenged in terms of hiring diversely as well as adequately supporting our students, educators, and community around questions involving diversity, equity, and inclusion. Available survey data and statistics highlight disparities in educational outcomes, especially for our Black and Brown students, as well as mental health challenges, which also affect many of our LGBTQ+ students and actually also our female students. Please tell us about a time when you have served as an equity leader to improve DEI goals. How did you communicate your DEI vision to a broader community to accomplish those goals?
Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so in where I am right now in Billerica, this is definitely at the forefront of our work. So I'll start with the strategic planning process that we just went through. So I led a couple of the groups around a strategic planning process, and my superintendent led 2 of the other groups. One part of that strategic planning process involves racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that is our vision. Like, if you read that clarifies what we are looking at by way of equity in our district, but it also makes a pretty big statement about how important it is for our students. So just to be clear, equity is not just this, big word that we all like to use. It is about how our students are experiencing their classrooms. And what I'm talking about is the sense of belonging. Students need to feel that they are valued in their learning communities. And so when that's not there, it's really hard for students to access the academic rigor that we want them to. That is the message as an equity leader that I have. It is about the students' experiences. Whether you call it equity or something else, that's what it is. When we work with staff, and we've done training with our staff, I led the work around finding a consultant to come do the training. I talked with them about what some of the needs are in our district, what some of the challenges are, where the pushback would be, and I met with them constantly about, as they were rolling out the training, just to take the temperature and give them feedback about how our staff was experiencing the training. And they made adjustments along the way with the idea that they want to make sure it's accessible to all staff. The other part of equity leadership, it is about communicating that vision, which we've done. It is about fielding the pushback, which we've gotten. And the one piece that I hold on to, because it is about the students' experiences, you can't convince me that that's not important. And so sometimes that's how I receive some of the pushback. So sometimes that's where I say, no, our students need to have that feeling of being valued in their classroom, no matter what their learning profile is, no matter what their demographic is. Some of the things that might come out too, that I know I've had conversations with staff about, things like bias, unconscious bias, absolutely can filter in. That's the area because there's no bad intention, but it can be some missteps that are taken because if one is not aware of their biases that they carry. And we all have them. And so the more awareness that you have about that, the more you're able to shape how you're talking with students and with families so that you can avoid those kinds of missteps. And to make sure that everyone feels included. The other area of the leadership, which is absolutely critical, and I was talking with teachers about this today, is when teachers also get pushback from it. And so really what they want to know is, are they going to be supported? Will they get backup on that work? And for me, it's like if you're working in service of the students, it's hard not to back you up on that one. The one piece, though, with all staff, that when I hear will you support me, the other question I hear behind that is, can I have those conversations? I'm not sure I know how to. So we need to work with staff to build up their capacity to be able to do that.
I have a follow-up. I'd like to ask how you would approach, or how you do approach assessing progress in advancing DEI goals and improving student experiences?
That is a great question, because we are now just talking about this. So we have a district-level DEI committee, which has staff, community members, student representation on there. And we have a consultant working with us on it. And our conversations one of our goals is to identify a data system that we can answer those questions. So I don't have it yet in place. Ask me in a few months. But I will say one thing that we are bringing in is a climate survey. We are not yet decided on what we're using. We're piloting Panorama, but there are other ones that we're looking at as well. That's going to be critical data for us. We have used youth risk surveys like YRBS, youth health surveys. So we've pulled in some of that as well. But those are the areas that we would definitely look at. I will say that also anecdotal data from students is really powerful for me. So when I hear directly from students what their experiences are like, that says a lot for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Geiser. So looking at the time, if you have a question for us, I think we have time for one question, and if you don't, that's okay. Do you have one?
All right, I think I have an obvious one. I've heard a lot of information today that tells me a little bit about this, but what are you looking for in your next superintendent? You knew I was going to ask that one.
Anybody else like to respond to that?
Start us off.
I'll start us off. Sure. So I think probably from some of the questions that were asked today, you have a good idea of what we're looking for in a superintendent. So the first thing that comes to mind for myself is somebody who is going to be a relationship builder and a partnership builder. I think that many school districts after COVID are really looking to bring community together with their schools and with their educators. I think especially in our district, given some of our challenges with the budget, that this is something that our district is certainly looking for, as somebody who will go out, roll up their sleeves, get into the schools, and partner with partners in the town as well as parents and educators.
Great.
I'll echo Meg. The two words popping into my mind were a collaborator and a community builder.
Thank you.
To add on to what others have already said, I think someone who is able to jump right into a very busy, complicated place and time and get up to speed quickly, but also somebody who is able to listen carefully to the perspectives really across the community, across the school system, before moving to moving ahead on their own. So building off of the collaborator and decision maker. Also somebody who can really help think about, again, sort of how our district is structured, areas that are strong, any areas where there may be gaps, and provides all the support and leadership to our amazing staff and educators and other leaders at all levels by both, again, leading with, ideas and expertise from their own experience, but also, again, really customizing that to what they are walking into right now. So,
Great. Thank you.
So with that in mind, if you could provide, as we come to a close here today, just a 2 or 3 minute statement about why you see yourself as a good fit in Belmont as a superintendent, and maybe some of the qualities that you would bring to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off with, I'm gonna say here what I said to the educators earlier. And I realize that my perspective from the outside may not match some who are in the moment. But when I look at the conversations that are happening, most of my looking at it means that I'm looking at it on a screen in a recording. All the tough conversations come up, and people disagree with each other here, of course. But what pulls me here, outside the fact that I'm a member of this community, but what really pulls me here is I see people just working together in order to solve the problems that are being faced. And I'm seeing a true collaborative nature with a genuine interest on serving the kids in Belmont in the best way possible. We don't always have the answers. We don't always know what our next steps is, but through that conversation and that collaboration, we'll figure it out. That's what I want to be a part of. I bring lots of different experiences with me. I mean, I've seen different ways of doing education, which I think I can bring with me here to offer, different ideas, but to your point, Amy, like coming in and looking at the context, right? And looking at what would work and what would not work. I'm not adverse to taking calculated risks, and the reason why I say calculated is because they have to be thoughtful and trying new things, but doing that in a way that's responsible. So that's where I feel like sort of Belmont is in a really great position right now to do things like that. And I think it's a strong community that works together and is able to have difficult conversations to figure out how to move it forward. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your time today for this interview. We will see you again, I believe, at 6 p.m. for a public forum.
Thank you very much.
And with that, I would ask for a motion to adjourn the school committee.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. So I'm going to reconvene the school committee. It is now 4:40. Welcome, Dr. Simon. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been enjoying your day in the district so far.
I have. It's been nice to have the tour and meet people, so it's been very much a welcoming environment, so thank you.
Great, thank you. So this is the school committee interview with the candidates, and the first thing that I wanted to do was to, first of all, make sure you've had a good day and, and let you know that we appreciate your time and your interest in the Belmont Public Schools. In just a moment, I'm going to ask each school committee member to introduce themselves to you. I know that you've met some of us during the day, but we will go through that process. And then after that, I will begin the Q&A. And so each school committee member has a question for you today, so there will be 6 questions. After each question and your response, a school committee member may have just a quick follow-up or a quick probe about that. So if you could keep your responses to the questions to about 6 or 7 minutes, that would be great.
Okay.
After that time is up, depending on the time remaining, I will ask you if you have any questions for us. And if you do and there's some time, we will take those questions. And then finally, we will end where you will have 2 or 3 minutes to let us know why you think that you're a good fit for the Belmont Public Schools as the next superintendent. And then we will close with that. Great.
Okay.
So again, we are being recorded. This recording is not live streamed right now, but it will be made available to the public after all candidates have completed their interviews tomorrow. There is no public comment during this time. I will not be taking any questions from the public, but as you know, there is a public forum later today, in which time we will field questions from the public. Great. So with that, Amy, if you could just start off and we'll just reintroduce ourselves to Dr. Simon, and then we'll get started with the questions.
I don't think it's on.
Hi, my name is Amy Checkaway. I've been on the school committee since 2019, and I also have a 10th grader and a 7th grader in the district, my kids as well. So nice to meet you.
Hi again, Jamal Sayh. I've been on the school committee for 2 years. I have one kid that graduated from Belmont Public School and another that is in high school currently.
Hello again, Dr. Simon. I'm Jeff Liberty. I'm finishing my first year on the school committee, and I have 2 kids in the Belmont Public Schools, one at the high school and one at the Chenery Middle School. Nice to see you again.
Yes.
So good to see you again, Dr. Simon. I'm Mike Crowley. I've been on the school committee since 2019, and my term is expiring in a couple of weeks. And so.
Welcome, Dr. Simon. My name's Catherine Bowen. I'm finishing out my 6th year on the school committee, and I have 2 students in the school system.
And again, I'm Megan Moriarty. I'm currently chair of the school committee and finishing my 2nd year. And I have twins who are actually in 6th grade here at the Chenery. With that, Amy, if you'll begin the questions.
Okay, our first question is about data-based decision-making. So increasingly successful organizations, including school districts, make systematic use of data to support problem-solving and decision-making. Can you please tell us about a time when you've used data to inform a critical decision about educational programming and/or strategies?
Yes, I can. So I'm very much interested in collecting data on multiple facets. I think what I find in many districts is that they look at data and they're examining student performance predominantly. And I think that that's very much important, and I think we need to make sure that we have that data that is accessible on a continuous basis, because we are constantly using information in its current state in order to guide our instruction. So I do think that that is important, and that is one example. However, I also feel that we need to have data for everything we do. We need to have data in the aspect of how we examine our finances, how we reflect that information. I think not only does data help us inform our decisions at the district level and at the board level, but it also helps us share this information with the public and give them the information to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why it's important. So one of the things that I did as superintendent, when I came into my position, I had the immediate need to respond to data associated with our COVID information. Number of students quarantined, how we were, number of staff members quarantined. What I felt before I was a superintendent in that position, I was a parent in the community, and the level of understanding what was happening at the district it really wasn't transparent to the families. And so when I came into that position, that was an immediate response that I had to make sure that we've corrected the system, because the system was not as timely as it needed to be. It was also putting the expectation and the weight on the administrators to be these collectors of data and inputters of data. And so we built that streamlined mechanism. In that same process, while we were tracking how our positivity rates were working, we also were transferring this out to the parents, and we used Qualtrics to share some of this information, and Tableau. Actually, Tableau I found to be quite helpful, where parents could access the information as well and also make their own data-informed decisions of how much positivity we had at a school level if they thought that the administrator was going to be out. So we had that. In that same process, we looked at other systems of how we were even tracking our materials. PPE was the example here, where we were hearing feedback from teachers that they weren't receiving the PPE, but we didn't have a nice system developed where we could actually track, was the PPE leaving the warehouse, getting to the teachers, and so forth. In that same timeline, we also had our ESSER funding. And I think it's really important to look at how we spend money. And I think sometimes you look at budgets and spreadsheets, and it's very hard with all of the line items to really discern what are we prioritizing and how we're making meaning out of the money that we're using and what we are putting our money toward. So we built using, again, the Tableau system, because what we also tried to do is make sure that all of our data that we were sharing across disciplines, across areas, had a similar look. So when our community members were engaging, they weren't learning a new tool, so we wanted to make sure that we had that. But it also helped us internally to see, in our ESSER spending, are we looking at mental health? Are we looking at facilities? How much funding are we putting into our staff members, to really decide, because how you spend your money really does say what your priorities are. And how you don't spend your money is also telling you what your priorities are. And so these would be systems that I would employ again. I think it's helpful. I'm a visual person as well, so I find these tools where not only you're looking at the data analysis and just collecting this information, but then displaying it in meaningful ways helps you guide decisions. And I think specifically for board, for community, it really facilitates understanding as well as asking better questions that we haven't even started asking yet. And so I use it all the time.
Thank you. Just to follow up, based on any of those experiences, is there anything, if you had to do it again, that you would do differently?
I mean, of course, doing anything again, you have the past experience to drive, how would we go about this? One of the things that I did that I would say I would totally do it again is when I came into the superintendent's position, there was one director, and he had an assistant, and his focus was on data. But he was only looking at student data. When I came in, based on what I was thinking was important, was I actually expanded that department. So I had not only individuals that were skilled in the data collection analysis, helping teachers and administrators interpret the data, but they really became a high-functioning team that I can't even see without that type of synergy of all of those groups looking at the whole system as a data collection, that was the right move, and they ended up being meaningful in so many other things. They started off of, we needed this to guide instruction, and then now we're using them, or we were using them to help us with taking on new challenges, like even examining our teacher evaluation, or our teacher surveys and our community surveys, to understand what we aren't asking, what we should be asking, and so forth. I'd say the only thing that I ran into that is something that I would want to think more of is making sure that our teachers really have the meaningful time to look at data and to be very focused on checking their assumptions and using data to help facilitate your thought process and not coming to some quick decisions. And sometimes we tend to do that, and I think one of the pressures is we just don't have enough time. So what I would like to do in the future is figure out how to schedule in that time so we can look at the data, marinate in the data, and take time to really process it and not just make quick decisions and being partially informed about the data, but probably not accurately informed.
These are heavy. The next question is around financial acumen. So in public school education, meeting all educational needs is a challenge because of budget constraints. Please tell us about a time when you employed creative problem solving and financial management principles to strategically solve budget shortfalls.
Well, so I shared one example with using Tableau to look at the data and to share the information. One of the things in the size of my district that I came from, which was 30,000 students, was that there were moments that unfortunately happened far too often where there were inefficiencies or there was a lack of just evaluating the usage of the funding and where we're going through. Something that I think is important to do specifically with money associated with budgeting is that you really do have to look at it as there is an input and output, the outcome and the impact. And I do believe money matters. I believe how we use our money matters even more so. And I think that this would be something that if I were into this position, I would do a deep dive exploration of what are we funding? Are we getting the return on investment? Are there ways to reallocate this funding to have a greater return on the investment, yet still check off the items that we were trying to address prior to? So I think that, you know, we can reallocate and reassess funding all the time, and sometimes we need to just to check in because sometimes we think everything's working fine and then we have to go back and look. Budgetary issues, I think, are always going to be the case within education specifically, and I think that these are things that we're going to continually need to look at. And in the same breath, I will say, you get what you pay for. And this is a high-quality education system, and I think it's important that we can't budget cut to where we are no longer able to deliver the high quality that is the expectation. And that's really a challenge because we have infinite wants and very limited resources.
That's true. But can you say a little bit more about how would you go about identifying these efficiencies in a district like ours, in a small district like ours, and how would you go about prioritizing the infinite needs versus the limited budgets?
Well, this would actually be a situation that I would anticipate would be working with the committee. There is the strategic planning aspect of priorities, and those are things that would help guide the direction that the district would like to take. And so this would be a discussion where we work together. There are analyses that need to occur with the budget, discussions. I've received considerable feedback today as well that I needed to make sure that when these topics are being considered is to talk to the teachers, talk to staff about what they see and how they see this funding. I think solutions are within the community. But I do think that, you know, as far as what the priorities are, that needs to be something that the committee directs the superintendent to work on, and that would be where the priorities would be set as, from my understanding of how to make the budgetary process work. I would not want to prioritize something budgetary-wise without the committee's full support of the decision.
Thank you.
Dr. Simon, the longer you're a leader, the more decisions you make. And sometimes those decisions are wrong. Please share with us a story about an important leadership decision in which you made the wrong call. Why did you make the decision you made? At what point did you realize you had made a mistake? And what did you do afterwards?
So I have two examples. So one example was, and this was in our COVID situation, and this was the spring of 21. And we were working with our medical advisory board, and they were suggesting that we might be able to start the fall semester with a relaxation of our mask requirements. And in that process, because I had had people from the community who did not want to have the mandatory masking, but I also had I had other individuals in the community who wanted the masking, it was a challenge because I wanted to communicate on the front end that we are in these conversations and there might be a light at the end of the tunnel. But I had, in my office, I had a PR director, and we crafted a letter explaining that we had had these meetings and there was a possibility that in the fall semester we would be able to lax. That was received from our families who wanted to have mandatory masking in a very, they were upset. And it was, I had to spend a considerable amount of time discussing that, you know, we will measure and make these decisions at that time, but based on where our numbers are going right now, we feel that we might be slowly being able to transition out of this. In my specific situation, the letter that individuals who are wanting the masking to continue, that letter ended up meaning nothing because when I started in the fall semester, that's when the Delta variant came, and that's when we did do mandatory masking because our contagion was so bad. And that also had its issues because we needed to operate our organization, but we still had many concerns with families who didn't want masking. And so it was a challenge because I think what I needed to have done in that situation is on one level you want to keep people informed, and on some levels you also can run into that it can upset even though the decision may change. Another decision I made, and I think this is a decision in the sense that it was a challenging time period, but I don't think I would have done anything different, but I knew that there was an issue. In my district, we would have teachers who were evaluated and they would be non-renewed in the process of the evaluation process. And there was not a history that was recorded of administrators being non-renewed. But I knew in my experience, especially in my area of training principals and superintendents in higher education as well, that we had some administrators who were not doing the job that needed to be done, and we had some issues. And so I non-renewed 9 administrators, and it was the first time ever that had ever happened. And the week before, 220 teachers were non-renewed, and there was not, it didn't make it into the press, but the 9 administrators it did, and it kind of blew up. But in my situation, I will say, as much as it was clearly a change in how the district had been running for probably the last 2 decades, I still think it was the right decision. We had administrators that could have been employed in other positions within the district, but as far as the position that they were holding, it wasn't aligning with the direction of my superintendency and the direction of the board that I was working with. And so it was one of those challenging, difficult decisions that I think was important for the organization, but it certainly, I cannot see in that situation, I've played it through my head many times, a smooth path. It was just going to be one of those, the challenging decisions of being a superintendent is sometimes you have to make unpopular decisions.
So if I might, that sounds like a good decision that was just hard. Is that fair to say?
I think it was a good decision in that situation, and I think for the masking email, that needed to have been slowed down. I think I was wanting to communicate so fast that I probably needed to hold off and marinate a little bit more and see if I could craft a way through that without it getting into the level it had.
Might there have been anything that you would have done differently around the non-renewal of the administrators to prepare the public for this change, or the community at large, or do you think it was just destined to be controversial and difficult because it was the first time?
I think it was destined to be controversial at that time. I think that there could have been some ways to perhaps lessen the impact, but I think that there was still going to be concern. One of the other challenges that I had is that at that point, some board members were very much in favor of this, and other board members were not so much, but it boiled down to a lot of, is this good for the person or is it good for the organization type of decisions, where I think that what we needed was our board members to focus on the organization.
Thank you.
Can I just, if I can just follow up on the slowing down question. You thought that you should have slowed down before you sent this email. How did that impact other decisions that you've made after that?
Well, I think, every experience, you should be gaining knowledge and experience and becoming a bit smarter in the process. I think, it's the double-edged sword of, I think I am very good at making decisions. I know that there have been, other administrators who really are reluctant to make decisions. In fact, I had a board that was very reluctant to vote accordingly to make decisions. And so I found myself many times presenting problems and leaving board meetings without direction, because having to make a decision requires a level of faith and a commitment. I do know that my pace can be different from many others, and I have been trying to make sure that if I do need to move fast, I need to communicate why, and then also taking some time to watch what is going on. I will say at that time period, the climate and the tense aspects of COVID in our community was pretty high. So I think it was going to be inflammatory regardless, but I do think that there was a level of perhaps looking at specifically the wording of that email and refining it a bit more. And I think that's one of the situation that I had is I had a PR director, and she would write the emails, and I think we all needed to probably sit and talk about it and reflect on how some people will receive it and others, and so forth. So. Mm-hmm.
Shifting gears a little bit, related to student learning, the Belmont School Committee hears from many families about the positive implications of serving more students from in-district programming and special education services. Please tell us about a time when you have led and evaluated program restructuring to better meet the needs of the population being served.
So I had quite a few experiences of redesigning the systems in the organization. So when I came in, what I had were professionals that had multiple job responsibilities that perhaps didn't align with their job title. And I think it's incredibly important to make sure that that is occurring. Because what I do have experience as well is when individuals carry multiple or wear multiple hats, that some things can slip through and they are missed. And so specifically in our special education organization or department of the organization, we ran into a few things. Our special education, I don't believe, was meeting the needs of the students prior to COVID. And then when COVID occurred, due to the fact that we didn't have students on campus and staff concerns as far as we had a retention issue, those problems became compounded. And so there was a need to reorganize the department, prioritize our students as far as making sure that we are having the staffing in a timely manner. We're looking at making sure that we're having our meetings. Of course, in that time period, we're also having our IEP meetings in a virtual setting, which ended up, I believe, being one of the positives that came out of COVID. Was I think the IEP meetings that we were having using Zoom was more effective than the ones that we were having in person, because it was just harder to get everybody at the table at the right time for that. So I think it's, my mother was a special education teacher. I think it is, I have 2 children with IEPs. I think it's paramount that we make sure that we are doing, one, what is federally required, and 2, making sure that we are providing the opportunities to have a high quality education to all of our students. And sometimes that does take a reorganization. And I think it's also back to the commitments and the priorities. If this is a priority and this is something that needs to be addressed, then I do believe that there needs to be the funding associated with it to drive that, because that is a key ingredient.
Just to follow up, if there were an interest in this community in bringing more student placements that are out of district for special education needs, bringing them back in district with suitable programming, how would you approach that, and what kind of a time frame would you assign to exploring that before a possible implementation?
So unfortunately, I don't know the scale and scope at this point of how many of these students are being provided instruction in other districts.
About 130.
Okay. My understanding is that this is going to be a resource discussion, and this is going to be perhaps, if everything stays the same financially, then this is an internal reallocation discussion, and that is going to take time. I think based on even knowing that information, at what grade levels, what are the levels of the needs, and class sizes and so forth. So I think that there's a considerable amount of information that needs to be assessed and processed. I understand the importance. So if I were to look at this just on a calendar level and a start date would be July 1, that would be something I would look at immediately. But I do not believe at this point, knowing what I know, that this is something that would be able to launch within a year. But I do think having it as a goal for the following fall would be important. I will also say, and I've watched some of your past board meetings, I understand this is a community need, and I think it's important to be able to have your children educated in the community in which you live, and so I think it should be a priority, and I would encourage the board to articulate that and talk about the funding allocations in order to meet that need.
Building community partnerships among schools, educators, parents, school committees, unions, and other local government budget decision makers is vital to running a well-functioning public school system. Please tell us about a time when you fostered effective partnerships to create and accomplish goals. Specifically, what relationship building strategies did you employ?
So, well, firstly, I like to talk to people. I like people. I like to get to know people and understand how we can find win-wins. I think that my experience in my life, as far as, from being trained in architecture to being a faculty member, I like to design opportunities, and I like to look at problems from multiple viewpoints and get feedback, because I think what we're talking about, and specifically in this community, the schools are so much a part of the town, and the town is so much a part of the schools, that everyone needs to have the high quality schools, and everyone also has their own interests and needs. So I think it's important to make sure that we're having these conversations all the time of why what I am doing is supportive for other individuals and what other individuals is important to what I do. In an example, so we had a situation at a school where we needed to have the facility emptied. And we also had in this community a part of our student population that were not having access to after-school care. And we were running into, actually, this was associated with, there was a criminal aspect because, certain age groups, if they were not in school, they were finding other things to do. There was also a level of intervention and family support. And so I had a school facility that happened to be empty. And I had nonprofit partnerships, and I had a few nonprofit partnerships that were from different age groups. And so one would serve elementary school, one would serve middle school students. And what we ended up doing is we were able to repurpose the school facility to actually be a community engagement space for our nonprofits. And so this was a way to benefit the nonprofits who also struggle to have spaces to provide their services. It was in our school community. It was a win-win as the superintendent because now I have a built-in community engagement with families. And I also have nonprofits who are working on similar work. They're doing the after-hours supports that we aren't doing in the K-12 because of our own hours. But now I also built my buy-in team. These were people now who understood what we were trying to do, and they helped. Because sometimes it just coming out of the superintendent's mouth or board members' mouths, it's received in a certain way, but now these partners are helping us get this information out. It also turned out to be a win-win in our situation because the facility did meet the needs of our students. Our students needed engagement. One of the things that was happening, and I think it would be something to consider across the country, we clearly had mental health needs. I was struggling to get school counselors staffed because we just had a shortage. Even at our university level, our graduates were short, to the point where we were paying for interns to come into our schools because we needed them so badly, which was a massive change in policy. But one of the other things is one of our nonprofits, actually 2 of them in this facility, they were hiring mental health counselors. So we may not have been able to provide the mental health during our K-12 day, but we knew that many of those students who needed that support were also getting it. And I think those are the opportunities that we need to look at, is collecting our efforts, because we really just can't work in silos, and we have to look at it. I mean, it's a community, and there's opportunities there. And so I would say that I see the job as the superintendent is to continually engage with the community. I know I will be new here, and so I have a lot of people to meet and a lot of conversations to have, so I think that opportunity is just there to discuss, like, where can we collaborate and combine efforts and not duplicate efforts and also not compete.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. You've mentioned that you have been in a much larger district and recognize that Belmont is a smaller one from where you've been. So just as a follow-up to that question, in the first 6 to 9 months, if you were this next superintendent of the Belmont Public Schools, what strategies might you use to build relationships specifically with our parents and our family community, and also with the school committee?
So being present and making sure that I'm attending meetings, watching past board meetings, understanding a bit more. I have quite a few questions to ask. I am very much appreciative that people have offered to, sit and speak with me and talk with me about their suggestions, their thoughts. When I was at the high school, I actually thought it was a great suggestion that I will be attending the student government meetings on a regular basis to get the feedback. And I think that that would also be something that I would be doing with PTO meetings. I consider myself, the responsibility would be to be out and meeting people and having these conversations. And I think for the first 6 to 9 months, most of it will be that type of exposure, listening, thinking, hearing feedback, processing. I don't think what I would like to do is not make any active moves until I have a good, comfortable understanding of what is here. Me coming from Florida with a very different set of laws and a very different financial structure and governing structure, I know I have a lot to learn. But I also think I'm a fast learner and receptive to thoughts and feedback. And I also do not like to be the sole decision maker. I understand that I am the person who will bear the responsibility of the decisions, but I very much encourage and appreciate feedback, and I want honest feedback and constructive feedback.
Thank you.
So shifting to DEI, in Belmont, we're challenged in hiring diversely as well as adequately supporting our students, educators, and community around questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Available survey data and statistics highlight disparities in educational outcomes, especially for our black and brown students, as well as mental health challenges, which also affect many of our LGBTQ+ students, as well as our female students. Please tell us about a time when you have served as an equity leader to improve DEI goals. How did you accomplish your DEI vision to a broader community how did you communicate your DEI vision to a broader community to accomplish these goals?
So before I was superintendent, the community that I was eventually the superintendent of was advocating for an equity plan because, as I shared a few times in other prior conversations, we were an A school district, but we had the largest achievement gap between black and white students in the state of Florida, which is pretty inappropriate. In that process, the previous administration had created an equity plan, and it essentially had a considerable amount of pushback because the community members weren't at the table. The discussions were after the decision had already been made, and that was a repeated feedback, was that why did you even engage us when you had already written the plan? And there was that issue. On top of that were things that we were looking at to measure equity and solutions that were brought to make equity had serious problems, and I'll give an example. One was having a lottery system to get into one of our high academic programs, as though a lottery actually has addressed equity. I think it's not a solution. And so when I was brought in, I was brought in by the new board majority to address this. And one of the charges was to look at the equity plan and to reimagine the entire situation. And I think that we do have to have considerable discussions about the data that we look at to look at our equity. I think we had, in my district, we had quite a few issues. So we had, the actual delivery of instruction. Low expectations are extremely important for us to talk about and check our biases. And so we had to do a lot of discussions about all students deserve high expectations, and we need to make sure that we're providing that safe learning environment for our students to meet that. We also had discipline issues. We had a disproportionate number of black male students who were being disciplined, but our discipline plan needed to be readdressed and reexamined. And then we had, we did have an equity or a guide for our LGBTQ+ students, and we collaborated with Equality Florida, which was the advocacy group in Florida, to help us create this document to support students, to make sure that we weren't having situations where they were being dismissed or bullied or marginalized. Unfortunately, we have some more complications associated with that right now because of just what is happening in the state of Florida. But I think those things we constantly have to talk about where our biases are and making sure that we are supporting our students. And I think that there are discussions that we need to have and reflections and making sure that we're providing the space to hear each other and to grow and to understand that not everybody is going to work at the same pace. And so I do think it's ongoing, and I think that even what I'm understanding with our students who are receiving services outside of the district, I would believe that falls into the equity discussion as well, and I think it's important to address. And so how I would look at this in this situation would be to make sure that I'm bringing key people into the discussions to share with me their thoughts and how we can do this, lean on expertise to help drive hiring practices. I think we should look at how we're recruiting and what type of an environment we're paying for our staff members as well. I think in HR specifically, I think there's a lot of discussions about the work environment and if we're providing a work environment that feels comfortable to all staff. And so I know that was a really long question, or a long answer, but I think there's so much that has to be addressed, and a lot of it needs to be discussed and modified, and it needs to be a living document, and I don't think we're ever there. And we can always do better.
Just a quick follow-up. How would you assess progress against DEI goals?
So I think this assessing progress becomes really, you have to be careful, and this goes back to the first question of how we look at data and how we make our assumptions. I think we should be using the data to help drive more questions. So as an example, I did look at Belmont's data. I did an ABC report, attendance, behavior, and curriculum. And although you have very strong attendance rate, you do have attendance issues and chronic attendance. And I think the questions at that point would be, well, what are we doing right now to address chronic absenteeism? And then also, then the next layer of, well, why aren't these students wanting to come? So you have, the what, but we really are looking at the why. And I think we have to have this in all of it. And so collecting that data is important, but that data has to drive other discussions. It needs to very much be like a quantitative and a qualitative analysis.
Do we have time for a follow-up, Meg, or should we move it forward?
No, you can ask Paul.
Just staying with the same theme of measuring progress, you mentioned that biases and low expectations are two indicators of an inequitable system or an inequitable learning environment for students potentially. How specifically do you know if there are low expectations and biases, and how do you know when those two areas have improved?
So I'm sorry, how do I know if that there are biases and low expectations? Well, I think there's always going to be biases. I mean, we're always going to have those, and we're going to have to continually check ourselves and reflect on it and reflect on our practices and working through that. Low expectations, and I think this goes into, one of the concerns that I have with DEI and how things can be what one person interprets as a DEI approach and how another person sees DEI. So an example will be the word inclusion. How I understand inclusion to mean is very different than how someone else might. And so somebody gave me feedback on what their interpretation of inclusion meant, and that meant lowering the bar. And I think that we have to make sure that we can talk about inclusion and providing spaces, but we can't lower our standards. And I think we also need to examine, why do we think that this is a lowering a standard? And some of this is going to be like discussions. I'm not sure if I can collect data that is going to say that we've lowered our expectations. I think this is more in the discussions and how we facilitate the opportunities for all of our students. I think especially if we're talking about, again, the students who are currently not being served within the district, when that service is provided within the district, making sure that it is the high quality environment and they're having access to professionals who are meeting their needs. And I think that we're going to have discussions about that and what it looks like and what it feels like, and it will be a continuous process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. So that concludes our questions from the school committee. I know you've said that you have a lot of questions, and we've met you today, and I appreciate the questions. But right now, I will provide time for if you have one question for the school committee that you would like to ask, and we will answer. And I'm going to do that because of the time. It seems that I want to provide each candidate the same number of opportunities for questions. So we're going to stick with one question if you would like to ask us.
Okay. I mean, I'll go for the low-hanging fruit. What are you wanting from the superintendent that would be stepping in, specifically as you have a superintendent who's been here for quite some time? What are your expectations of our relationship, our engagement, and how do you know that we're functioning in a high level?
Sure, I'll start off. So I think some of the questions that we've asked probably let you know some of the areas of our interest and our priorities. When I think about a superintendent the next superintendent for the Belmont Public Schools, I want somebody who is going to come in and be a relationship builder and partner with the wonderful educators and staff that we have here, as well as with other town departments and families, and also with the school committee. And somebody who's going to be willing to roll up their sleeves and get out into the schools and find out what's going on, what's working really well, and what are some of the things that they see could be improved, and be able to bring that back to the board and have good discussions around that.
And I would just pick up on the last thing that Meg said. And I think it's from the way that you asked the question, how do we know that we're operating at a high level or high functioning? And I think that's really an exciting question, because what I'd love to see are the quality of the conversations that we're having around the school committee table with the superintendent, and the quality being the options that are being brought, the rigor that is being brought, and the foresight of not constantly firefighting, that we're anticipating some of these issues that are getting ahead of it. Belmont is a great town with a great school system that we'd like to maintain as being a great school system. So we're looking at somebody that can build on that. But at the same time, we're looking at somebody that's looking for all the different opportunities for efficiencies within the system in order to have a sustainable excellence in our district. So that's, for me, is what I'm looking for in a school committee, rather superintendent.
I'll add, and you've spoken to this a bit as well, someone who is ultimately student-centered and thinking about the needs of all of our students, and how we know what students' needs are academically, social, emotional, and otherwise. Again, using data, but also all of the different perspectives and folks who are interacting with students, including, of course, their families. So I think always being grounded in the students and how to create the best possible learning environments. And as Jamal said, not being shy to bring forward different ideas, even if we can't move forward with all of them right away.
So that was a perfect leading question for our final question or ask of you, and that would just be in 2 to 3 minutes, if you could tell us why you think you would be a good fit for the next superintendent of the Belmont Public Schools.
So I think specifically when it comes to the financial concerns, I think that this is where my expertise is. I understand how systems work. I like to develop systems. I very much think it's important to also communicate with everyone why I think this is important and why it's important to invest in education and how the money is allocated and how the fiduciary responsibility really rests in my hands, along with working with the school committee. And so I think that I bring this expertise specifically associated with the funding concerns. I also believe that I am a very good and strong and passionate advocate for not only public education, but also for my board. When my board gives direction, I will do whatever I need in order to make sure that I am returning their expectations and delivering what they're asking for. That's not to say that it's easy, and that's not to say that it's going to be without bumps, but I like challenges. I like designing new approaches. I appreciate the point about bringing ideas. I think one of the benefits of me having a more non-traditional path is that I don't see problems in a traditional way. I think there's many other ways that we can approach our problems that are not perhaps how things are done in the K-12 education system. I think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation that has been untapped for decades in the world or in the U.S. education system, and I think that I can bring that. And I do believe that working collaboratively is the way to have solutions, and it has always been my style, and I think it's something that would benefit this community as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to conclude the interview right now, and we will see you back here at 6:40. And before I do adjourn this meeting now, because the forum is actually posted as a separate meeting, I just want to remind school committee members that we need to be back here at 6. That being said, please don't gather as a quorum in the next 15 minutes because we will actually be adjourned from our meeting. So can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Simon.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I am going to call the school committee to order about 4:03 p.m. I'd like to welcome Dr. Carter for joining us here today. I'm going to go ahead and call Dr. Carter Kimo, which is okay with him. And we are here today for our school committee formal interview of Kimo, who is interviewing for the position of the superintendent of Belmont Public Schools. I first want to just take a moment, and I want to thank the Belmont Media Center for being here today. They are recording this. It is not being live streamed at this time. After Kimo is done with his interviews and forums today, these will be edited by the Belmont Media Center, who is working really hard and overtime at it, and I really appreciate that. And they will be posted as soon as possible. Because there may be a delay till tomorrow or potentially a little longer for them to be posted, we will be extending the survey date for the feedback survey until Tuesday, and all of that will be available on our webpage. I will not be taking public comment during this period of the meeting. However, there is a public forum following this at 6 p.m. in which we will be taking public questions. So I'm just going to take a moment and go through what the interview entails. I will have each school committee member introduce themselves briefly to you first, and then we will begin with our questions. Each school committee member has a question for you. They will read the question, and then you can respond and take up to 6 or 7 minutes for a response. If a school committee member has a quick follow-up or a probe, they may also ask that after they're done before it goes to the next question. When all of those questions are done, I will ask you if you have a question for us that you would like to ask tonight. And after we respond, then you will have 2 or 3 minutes to let us know why you feel that you are a good fit for the Belmont public school system.
Thank you.
So I will begin by asking Member Checkaway to introduce herself.
Hi, Dr. Carter. Amy Checkaway. I have served on the school committee since 2019. I also have 2 students and sons in the district, a 10th grader and a 7th grader, and moved to Belmont 11 years ago. It's very nice to meet you, and thank you so much for your interest in this.
Hi again, and welcome to the district. I'm Jamal Say. I've been a school committee member for 2 years. I have one kid who graduated from Belmont Public Schools and another that is in high school currently.
Good afternoon, Dr. Carter. It's nice to see you again. My name is Jeff Liberty. I'm finishing my first year on the school committee, and I have 2 children in the Belmont Public Schools, one in the 10th grade at the high school and one in 7th grade at the Chenery.
Hello again, Dr. Carter. I'm Mike Crowley. I've been on the school committee since 2019. I have a couple of weeks left, and I do not have any children in the system.
Welcome, Dr. Carter. My name is Catherine Bowen, serving on the school committee since 2017, finishing in April, and I have 2 children in the system.
And I'm Megan. We've met, and I'm currently chair of the school committee, and I have twins who go to school here at the Chenery, and they are in 6th grade. So thank you for being with us. And with that, Member Checkaway, you can begin with your question.
Okay, so our first question is focused on data-based decision-making, problem-solving. Increasingly successful organizations, including school districts, make systematic use of data to support problem-solving and decision-making. Can you please tell us about a time when you used data to inform a critical decision about educational programming and/or strategies?
All right, that's a great question. First, I want to take an opportunity to thank all of you and thank everyone who arranged my visit. I had a wonderful visit today. Especially appreciated visiting our high school leadership team, our students in the high school leadership, just want to give a shout out to them and just sort of express my appreciation and gratitude. It's been a memorable day for me so far. So I will now talk about data, and that's true. So data drives an organization's improvement. It's very important to understand the breadth of data, because the idea is we want different kinds of data to triangulate what, to sort of identify what perhaps an area of improvement might be, whether it is about a student's learning, because it could be based on an individual student, whether it's about a school program, whether it's about an instructional practice, but really it is the engine. Actually, it's not the only part of the engine. I would say the engine is teams using data to inform best practices, all supported by professional learning, professional development. So those are the 4 components, and you can sort of see where data fits as districts and organizations improve. So your question was, how do we figure out, how did we use data to sort of figure out exactly what as far as our programming is concerned. So I'm going to go to the social emotional area right now, because often in social emotional issues, data is harder to sort of figure out. Sometimes in academic issues you can use MCAS scores, you can sort of use numbers, but in social emotional areas where we feel that there's a deficit, you need a balance of sort of quantitative data and qualitative data, stories, and reports there. So let's take ourselves back to the pandemic. And I think many school districts in Massachusetts had experienced sort of almost an explosion of students who are having really some difficulties with their mental health. Sometimes it's depression, sometimes anxiety, sometimes, and that was really interfering with their learning there. And so as we were recovering from the pandemic and trying to bring students back into schools and figuring out how do we spend this federal funding that we have, coming from in the most impactful way we can. We used data to try to measure how especially our high school students were affected by, COVID-19, the going remote, having a hybrid model, and all that. And the data that we used was, first of all, looking at the national trends and seeing, reports from, organizations like, American psychiatrists and things like that, saying that that they see a spike in mental health. We had referrals. We knew, as far as the number of times students had met our mental health supports, our guidance counselors, our social workers, our mental health people, and also how many times we were trying to refer students to outside mental health experts, sometimes on a sort of a regular basis, but other times on an emergency basis because there were some critical situations there, and tabulating that was really important, sort of to know that. Finally, we started interviewing students. We had our youth risk behavior survey, and we had a huge spike in reports as far as how students were feeling and what kind of risky behaviors they were partaking in. We found a huge spike in our LGBTQ+ students and how they were coping. And so that was a group that we really needed to focus on, and our girls in general. There was a lot of data that showed that traditionally in certain areas where boys would have more risky behaviors than girls, say like drinking at Weston, that was one thing like that. Girls had caught up and surpassed boys, and so we knew our girls were struggling as well. And so what we ended up doing is that we used much of our ESSER money to shore up our mental health counseling and systems. We hired 3 full-time counselors or social workers, 1 for the middle school, 2 for the high school, and that started to help. And what we are doing now, as the federal funding is going, and because the mental health isn't going away, the mental health issues isn't going away, and our most recent youth risk behavior survey is showing that. We are trying to figure out how we can incorporate those 3 very important positions in our operating budget so that they are not dependent on grant funding anymore.
Thank you. Just as follow-up, curious about how you could tell that the additional supports were helping students.
Well, that's really important too. I think one of the things that we want to do is we want to a couple of things. We use some data. A really important piece of data was the number of students or the number of times we needed extra help from outside the district to support a student. And often that was sort of in a more of an emergency kind of case basis. Another piece of data that we used is also student testimonials. Often when students go into crisis or are in danger of going into crisis or feel bad about that, there is a sort of a therapeutic reflection process that we hear that the guy in private, as far as that type of thing. But what we can learn from those direct service providers, the guidance counselors, the social workers, is stories about how we have been either effective or less effective than we wanted to be with particular students. And that story data, I'm trying to make this all in connection about how we use data. When it comes to solving problems, often the number data, which is often more of a broad view of what's going on, doesn't get to the place where we can actually find solutions. You have to dig deeper and you have to listen to stories, often from those populations who are most affected or who might be negatively affected by what we're doing, to really get an understanding of how our programming works. And we need to be sort of honest when we hear those stories, because sometimes, especially in the mental health area, some stories are really hard to hear, that we didn't do what we could do. And that's extremely important data. And that's not what people think when they think about data. They think about rows and columns of numbers. But story data, especially when it comes to problem solving in education, is probably the most important piece of data that you can use.
If I can just have a quick follow-up on this, what was your role in trying to get at the story, at that data, and what did you do with it?
So I'm the data person in the district as the Assistant Superintendent of Teaching and Learning. Actually, it's sort of in my wheelhouse. I'm a data-wise coach. Data-wise is a structure of how we can manage data in education. It's sort of a process that Harvard University promotes, and it's the system that I know best, but there's certainly other systems that work well too. I'm not going to do that. So when it comes to data, the district looks to me, as far as what the plan is, as far as getting things there. So we knew we had a problem. We needed to know exactly what the problem was. I worked along with the student services director, because the student service directors are sort of in charge of our counselors and our social workers. And together what we did is we developed a plan of trying to find multiple sources of data so that we could triangulate what the problem is. And in this case, the data was loud and clear. Hey, this was one of the most important things that we could do to use that extra federal funding that we could use. And so, again, sometimes you have to sort of sift through, and sometimes the data screams at you saying, this is what we have to do. And when that has to happen, you don't have to deliberate much. You just go. And so what we did is we worked together as a team with the superintendent, with the assistant superintendent of finance and operations. As we were creating the ESSER grant, we really prioritized mental health support for our secondary students.
Thank you. We're going to shift gears a little bit to financial acumen. In public school education, meeting all educational needs is a challenge because of budget constraints. Please tell us about a time when you employed creative problem-solving and financial management principles to strategically solve budget shortfalls.
All right. I actually have a lot of choices here. I'm trying to figure out a good one. Give me a minute.
Take a second. Take a minute.
All right, I'm going to go back to Watertown Middle School. When I was in Watertown Middle School, Weston is a very wealthy district, and sometimes we don't face the same kind of budget decisions that a typical district might face. Watertown's more like a typical district where most years there are some budget cuts going on there. So one thing that we were faced with at Watertown Middle School is that we had a cohort of students who are on the autism spectrum in the elementary schools, and we knew that we needed to create a program for students who are on the spectrum. And a very inclusive program, because many of our students were high functioning on the autism spectrum, where they needed a lot of support, but they also needed to be included in the general education classrooms and be able to be provided accommodations and there. And we didn't have the money for it. You know, what we would have to do is we would have had to cut programming, you know, really important programming, you know, in the school in order to do that. And then we were faced with a real dilemma of how do we create this program and continue the same kinds of offerings, both in general education and special education that we needed in the school. So one thing that we did was we were able to fund some of the programming, but not the whole program. Because what you need in a connections program is what we thought, as far as looking at this, the kids' individual education plans. We needed a teacher, but we also needed instructional assistants to work with students one-on-one as they were trying to access curriculum in the classroom. What we were ending up being able to do is we worked really hard with the Director of Student Services, so that, because we did have a cadre of really highly skilled instructional assistants in our school. We were lucky to have a good pipeline at that time with instructional assistants who wanted to become teachers, you know that kind of person who are on their way to getting their certification. And so we were able to, and again, we had to work with parents, but what we were able to do is, with the inclusion support, we were able to use the same instructional assistants to support the whole class, then to attach an instructional system to one child there for many of the kids in the program. Not all. Some kids needed a one-to-one assistant, and you have to do what is right for the student, you know, when you develop an individual education plan. But what we were able to do is to use the resources that we had sort of in other special education programs to accommodate these students as they were in the classroom. Was it a perfect program? No, but being able to utilize the instructional assistants, really a highly talented group of instructional assistants, to their full capacity, was a creative solution to manage that school budget difficulty that we had.
I think that's a great example. Is there at times when solutions like this require cutting programs? How do you go about making decisions?
That's really difficult. The budget process, from the superintendent to principals to directors and department heads to teachers and back, I think needs to be very clear and transparent as we go through there, because no decision is easy. And typically when a cut happens, it impacts students there. And again, back to the previous question, data is really important to really understand looking at data to understand what the potential impacts might be to students, and not thinking of just of stories of what people would want, but actually looking at the hard data as far as what class size levels might be, what caseload levels might be, what a lack of programming in a certain area might look like, an elimination of a special, that kind of thing. So it's got to be data driven, and what principals need to be charged, because principals know what's happening in their building, and it's really important to include principals in the data process, in this budget process, because they know what they can sort of get away with a little bit less staffing, and they know what is absolutely essential that they can't live without. And so what you would do is you would say to the principal, we need to lose a position. We need to lose 2 positions. We need this kind of cut. And we need to allow principals to work with their teams, their leadership teams, and figure out creative solutions that is as least impactful for students as they can, and back it up with the data. And as central office administrators, we need to support principals in finding the ways to do that, but letting the principals tell us what the least impactful cut is. And if we feel that that might not be a good, we push back, from a central office standpoint, so that there is a dialogue. And often those conversations are really difficult and hard, and often you need some protocols to manage those conversations because emotions do run high, and that's something that needs to be sort of set up. But it's important for the superintendent to listen to the principals and the department heads and directors, knowing that they have their programs to protect, to make that decision. And then what needs to happen at the central office level is there needs to be sort of a rank order. Here's our priorities. Here's priority 1, here's priority 2, here's priority 3, here's priority 4, all the way down, and here's the line, what we can fund and what we can't fund. And then it goes right back down to those people. What do you think about these priorities? And again, difficult conversations, but the reasoning behind it, and that's why the data is so important, to figure that out. And then once that's resolved, it can go right back up to, and that would be, say, the superintendent's recommended budget for the school committee as they go. So see how it sort of goes back and forth, transparency, and not being afraid to have those difficult budget conversations when cuts are necessary.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Carter, this next question is about mistakes. The longer you're a leader, the more decisions you make, and sometimes those decisions are wrong. Please share with us a story about an important leadership decision you made in which you made the wrong call. Why did you make the decision you made? At what point did you realize you had made a mistake? And then what did you do about it after you knew?
All right. I think I'm going to use the same scenario that I used in my previous interview, if that's okay with you, but if you want something different,
It's not really about what I want. It's what you want to share with us.
All right, I'll share that one because I think it's an important one, and I learned a lot from it. So I think I'm there. So our district in Wesson, we are very committed to working toward teaching all students and being more equitable for all students. And one area where our high school teachers were really very enthusiastic about that, and again, you listen to teachers, and if they want to do something, you work on sort of scaling up that and trying to make that work, was consistent grading practices with the high school with equity in mind. So there were 2 grading practices that we had in a fairly large inclusive committee with teachers and other service providers and some students as well. We talked a lot about grading, and in particular, 2 things that we wanted to implement. One was a raising of the floor of the 0 to 100 scale so that the floor is 50, so that the band that represents F is the same width as the band that represents D, C, B, and A. We felt that, and research also supports, that if a child misses something, whether it's intentional or unintentional as far as missing something, that 0 artificially weights that assignment disproportionately to other assignments. And we are actually grading a student's dependability or executive functioning skills maybe more than necessary than actually weighting their understanding of the material that they're supposed to learn. So that was one of the proposals. And the second proposal was to allow students who had not yet earned a B on a summative assessment to take a retake, to have a retake, so that they can demonstrate their knowledge there. Because again, we believe that learning is growth-oriented, and if a student fails the first time or doesn't do very well the first time, they should have a second chance. And we only offered 1 second chance. That was actually back and forth, because some teachers wanted to offer multiple second chances, and there was a lot of back and forth there. So those were the two proposals that we brought forth to the superintendent and to the school committee, and we announced at the school committee meeting that here are some things that we are going to pilot, actually. And it was for this year. This actually happened this fall. One thing that's very important when we work on equity is that we need to make these improvements together. And sometimes it's hard to bring people along who are reluctant to do these kinds of things. And it's often hard to rein in people who want to do more than what's there. But often with initiatives like this, it's important that we do the initiatives together. And we have to sort of mind both the foot draggers, the teachers who don't want to do as much as what we want to do, and we also have to mind those early adopters, those people who want to go further. And what my big mistake was is I didn't mind the early adopters as much as I should have. So what ended up happening is that because there's a tradition in Weston where teachers, high school teachers, can kind of determine their own grading practices, and this was a brand new thing as far as trying to sort of at least make some grading practices consistent. Some teachers decided to go further and take a sort of a more drastic step with equity in mind. And that drastic step was not to count homework. What ended up happening as students and parents learned that some teachers were not counting homework is that issue came right up to the top, and we lost the narrative. So while generally parents were neutral about raising the floor to 50 and actually pretty supportive about giving a retake, they were adamantly 100% against not counting homework. And from my point of view, that's not something that I can support either. I think homework is important in its right scope. I mean, I don't want to overburden, but when it comes to practicing skills, homework is important. Just like if you are practicing an instrument, or you're practicing a sport, or you're practicing your writing, you are going to get better with practice, and homework can help you with that. So I am actually a supporter of homework, and that sort of flies in the face with some research and things like that, and there's a whole homework debate about that. But we were not ready to tell the community that we were not counting homework, even in some classes. So what ended up happening? We had a principals community forum, trying to talk about these two grading practices. We had an auditorium that was absolutely filled with parents who were really worried about their students' grades, or their children's grades, because there was a perception both from students and parents, and probably a true perception in many classes, that homework was the device to save the grade from being too low from the hard tests and quizzes that kids would have. So there was a worry that grades would plummet, and of course, grades are tied to college applications, and it's a high stakes kind of thing. So we got a huge backlash. School committee and administration got that, and again, I was the point person. I led the forum. It was a very difficult one, though I think the public handled themselves well, from a decorum kind of standpoint. And we had to retreat. We had to stop. We had to stop what we were doing. We had to sort of. And it was a really difficult conversation to have with our high school and middle school teachers, who are on board and really excited about saying that we cannot move forward because we do not have the community support for this.
Do you mind if I just dig in a little bit,
Yeah.
Dr. Carter? Because you seem to pinpoint the nature of the mistake in, if I'm using your words correctly, not minding the early adopters well enough. Is that fair to say?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
I think part of it was communication we felt though those two things were technical enough that, well, let me back up. Some things that we do as far as improvements are technical improvements that really should involve educators. And some improvements that we need to do are more adaptive, cultural kind of improvements that we want to do. And when you do that, you need to involve all stakeholders and have a place at the table. So the homework piece, that is more of a cultural adaptive change in sort of how schools run, while the other ones, in my opinion, are more technical.
So was it a case that you did not anticipate teachers taking that extra step, and therefore you were not able to prepare the community for that change? Is that an accurate description?
That's pretty
of what
accurate,
happened?
yeah, I would say that's accurate, but I could have, I should have.
And
I
do
knew
you think
teachers
it
were
would have made a
thinking about
difference?
it.
Could you have convinced parents in Weston that it was okay to not have homework?
No, not at that time. What we would have needed to do is we would need to have formed a study group. We would have to include students, parents, teachers as stakeholders. We would have to review the research. We would have to come to a decision about the role of homework in the high school. That would have been at least a year-long process. We would have to vet our findings to the larger community before we make any of those decisions. And we would take that plan of action. And because we didn't take those steps, parents felt blindsided, students felt blindsided. It was hurtful. It was not a good scene, and it was a mistake on my part.
I appreciate you telling the story again. I learn something new each time I hear it, so thank you.
Yeah. Oh, one thing, can I just add?
Please.
One thing that we did after we acknowledged the mistake is we had a series of community forums. And instead of having a whole group of people in the auditorium, we limited those community forums to 20 people, sat in a circle so that everyone could be heard. And we listened hard, and we acknowledged what we could have done differently. And that helped. There's still a residual, there's still fence mending to make, after this. And I think we had, probably 10 of these forums. And that really helped. And so when you do make a mistake, it's really important to acknowledge that and then start that healing process, because generally when you make a mistake in positions like ours, hurt happens. And we need to acknowledge the hurt and make sure that, and do our best to take steps to improve.
Thank you. This question has to do with learning access for students, and you touched on it a little bit earlier. The Belmont School Committee hears from many families about the positive implications of serving more students with in-district programming and special education services. Please tell us about a time when you have led and evaluated program restructuring to better meet the needs of the population being served.
So that's really important to do, to really to be able to sort of on a yearly basis know the programming that our students are receiving in special education, because what often happens is that cohorts develop, and where you would be able to let me stop. Can you repeat your question? Because I don't think I'm going to be answering it the way you want it. I need to think a little bit more. I'm sorry.
I think you are, but I will say it again. The Belmont School Committee hears from many families about the positive implications of serving more students with in-district programming and special education services. Please tell us about a time when you've led and evaluated program restructuring to better meet the needs of the population being served.
Okay. So in Weston, we found, as we were reviewing our programming and what students were in what program, which students were placed in other schools, which students we were trying to serve, that we were serving within Weston, what was the nature of their disabilities and things like that. And that takes a team approach, because again, at the central office level, we don't know the stories of all the students, but we do know what's going on with our team chairs and our teachers really do know that. So there's a process of sort of figuring that out. But what we did is we discovered that there were a number of cohorts, especially right at the very beginning of my time in Weston. We found a number of cohorts that were possible to have in Weston so that we could bring students from an external setting back into Weston. And that's a desirable thing to do. It's a less restrictive environment for students, which is what IDEA calls for as far as the federal law is concerned. And obviously, it's much more cost-effective if you have that cohort. However, I just want to make sure that people know that there's a reason why individual education plans are individualized. It's because every student is different, especially students who have disabilities. And it's really important to have that team process so that we can find the best learning solution for all students, for each and every student. Not only do we need to consider the kind of instruction that the student needs, but we also need to consider the cohort that that student learns in. And in a district as small as Weston, and I think Belmont is a smallish district as well, a little bigger than Weston, sometimes when you lack the cohort, because learning is a social enterprise, kids learn better when they are learning with their peers instead of in a sort of a one-to-one tutorial kind of situation. If we don't have the cohort, it's really hard to provide adequate instruction for students. And because our mission is to reach and teach all students, because we are public, it's very important to consider that. But what we found is we found some cohorts. So we were able to create 2 programs in Weston, K-12. One was a language-based program that now is really well attended all the way through, and that had saved a whole lot of a placement. And another is what we call a Bridge and Compass program. We have 2 programs, Bridge and Compass at the high school and middle school, and that is for students who need some more direct intervention, therapeutic intervention as they work their way through the school day, and a drop-in place so that they can get that kind of sort of period by period or day-to-day counseling that they need, as well as some academic support as well. So those were the 2 cohorts that we created programs for. And again, the Bridge and Compass program are overflowing because of our mental health issues, and we're working to try to adequately staff that. The thing about bringing students in is that there is a time when it's not cost effective because you're building the program. You have to hire the people first and then bring students into the program. And often it's a piecemeal process because everyone has their own time frame as when their IEP comes up and when we can actually start moving that. And the IEP process is a negotiation. And so sometimes we can bring kids in, and sometimes the decision by the team after discussion is maybe the external placement is a better placement. So it's not an immediate cost savings. In fact, it's an investment a little bit first, and then the cost savings happens in the long run. And so that's something that people need to understand as we develop special education programming.
If I could just follow, maybe you could share a little bit more about one of those programs specifically, since it sounds like they were newly created.
Yes.
And just walk through that process a little.
All right, so the language-based program we created, we knew we had cohorts of students in all schools. And we have a K-3, a 4-5, a 6-8, and a 9-12. And we had an inordinate number of students who are enrolled in schools like Carroll School, who are really high-functioning, very capable students. And in a previous administration, they were being placed out instead of being handled in the building. So the first thing that we did is we started the program at the elementary level, where we knew that we had the biggest cohort, and we knew that if we could catch kids at the elementary level, we could build programs as they are moving up from grade to grade further. And we did our best to attract students at other levels to come back as well. So we were able to put that in the budget. We were able to make that investment. It involved hiring more special education teachers and instructional assistants in the district. we certainly had to account that, in the budget. And we justified that with anticipated cost savings from out-of-district placements, but that was down the road. And so with the support of the school committee and the town, we were able to make that investment and build that program. And again, the actual building of the program is really that teacher, leader, and the principal, and us supporting them. But again, and also with the director of student services, so that there's a continuancy, there's a consistency as kids move forward as far as expectations for students.
Just to follow up, so in Belmont, we've had a recent upsurge in out-of-district placements, and there has been a long-term interest in handling more of the needs of our special education students in district where possible. And with the new middle and high school building, we may now be at the point where we have the space to incorporate new programming. But the question really is, what are your thoughts about how much time is needed to assess what can be done in terms of creating a program to bring more students back in district? How long does that take, and what does the process look like?
I think it depends on a number of things, a number of factors. It depends on what kind of program it is and what the goals of the program is. I think, for instance, our Compass and Bridge programs aren't as sort of all-inclusive programs compared to our language-based program, and certainly not as in our Watertown Connections program. So it depends on the nature of the program. The more involved the program is as far as developing, managing that, for most of the school day, the more time it will take. But there's some urgency also, as far as this is concerned. Sometimes, especially when there are opportunities to save money and save, other options in the budget, where you can put this on the fast track and do your best as far as creating a program. So, for instance, in Watertown, when we made our connection program, we knew we had a need right away. The kids were coming, and we knew that the district wasn't going to outplace them, and we had to educate them. So we hired our connections teacher as early as possible. That was around February, and we started working diligently. We teamed with her as far as imagining what a program might be, making sure that there was time to vet with the stakeholders, involved in that program, particularly the parents of the students who are coming to the middle school, and being able to describe and getting their input as far as what we needed to do, and then actually doing the work over the summer, what it involved is actually paying the teacher a little bit more in the summer so that we could set up the program, because it was so essential that program was going to start at that time. And that's actually the nature of special education. When you bring a student back, you better be ready, and that's something that, and I think it can be done if there's some focus and resources devoted for it, and a real willingness, on the districts and the schools' part to create these programs. The space issue is a huge thing, and that's something that I think will be really helpful in Belmont. And I think this there may be some possibilities there. I would certainly have to learn a lot more about where our kids are and what they're doing. But that could be a possible long-term, more efficient way of moving forward and still serving all the the kids' needs.
Thank you.
So when I ask this question, I am going to ask you to look back but I also want you to be thinking about how it might be useful to you as the next superintendent of the Belmont Public Schools. Building community partnerships among schools, educators, parents, school committees, unions, and other local government budget decision makers is vital to running a well-functioning public school system. Please tell us about a time when you fostered effective partnerships to create and accomplish goals. What relationship building strategies did you employ?
All right, that's good. I completely agree with that. I mean, when you look at schools and the whole school community, which includes students, teachers, administrators, family members, residents who don't have students in the school, the most effective school systems have a web of interconnection relationships where there is a common focus on students and their well-being. And there's an accountability to one another on the behalf of students and families. So that's where we want to, and I think Belmont has a lot of that, but when you're a superintendent and you're brand new coming in, that is probably the #1 job, to become part of that network, and because you're superintendent, to model and lead that, because not only does it have to happen at the superintendent level, it has to happen with all district administrators, school administrators, those connections, teachers. Those connections are very important, and that communication is very important, and having multiple layers and levels of communication are very effective. So I'm going to go to my past, thing right there. And I'm going to go to, I'll go to Watertown again. This is my last year in Watertown. No, my second to last year in Watertown, and we had an interim superintendent at that time. And one of the things that he charged me with was to lead a committee to explore school start times, particularly following the research saying that our teenage students, from a learning perspective, could use a later start and sort of flip-flop, because we had a very early start. We had 7:35 starts for our middle school, and I think a 7:50 start for high school, and our elementary schools started later. And what would it take to flip that? So one of the reasons why he appointed me to be the leader of that team is because I had 12 years of experience in Watertown, and I had that time so that I knew people from the different stakeholder groups, and I had good working relationships with transportation, with athletics, with teachers who were concerned that their commute times are going to get longer, as things go, with other administrators, with community members, like Watertown Rec and other pieces there, because there's a lot that goes on with a shift like that, and it actually became quite contentious as far as the discussion in the committee, as far as what, why would we want to do it and how would we want to do it. One thing that was really important was making sure that students were involved in that committee, because students were, by and large, very supportive of having their days start. The high school students were very supportive of having their days start a little bit later there, and that's probably what pushed us to actually being able to create a report to bring to the school committee. We resolved a whole lot of issues, including lights on the field so that we can have athletics, because Watertown athletics are so important in Watertown. The bus schedules had to be sort of thought of, and we had to invest in another bus in order to make this work. We had to think about the hockey rink. We had to think about a whole lot of different pieces about that. And still, it took the current superintendent in Watertown, Dr. Galston, spent her whole first year working on this after the community had the recommendation, trying to get stakeholders on board and making it work. And to her credit, she drove that to the finish line, and now Watertown has late start times for middle school and high school students. Weston also does that. That was before my time. They made that shift as well, and I think we're better off for that, actually.
Thank you. Can you just say a little bit more about, so you mentioned that sometimes things could get contentious in these type of situations. So as a superintendent, you know, when you're in that type of situation, based on your previous ones, what are you thinking? What strategies do you employ when it does get contentious in that relationship building?
Yeah, I think it's really important to listen and hear where they're coming from. And often when people start, they're sort of high on that ladder of inference. They're sort of making some assumptions that may not be true or maybe only partially true and things like that. And one thing that has really worked well for me in any kind of difficult conversation that I've had is to being able to walk the person down through listening and actually, you know, being actively curious, asking questions, walk the person down the ladder of influence so that we get to sort of what the real situation is and acknowledge their point of view. And if you disagree with that point of view, then and only then you can walk up your own ladder of inference. Okay, here's what I was thinking, that, you know, from the facts. Here's what I was thinking, and there. And having that respect, and it takes time and energy to do that, but again, it's time well spent. And having that respect and dialogue is really important in order to either come to a we agree to disagree, or to come to, hey, there might be something that we can build consensus on as we move forward. And I think one thing that happened during the really sort of hard and hot debates within that committee was giving time and space for student voice to be heard, because I think that was our point of, we were disagreeing on a lot, but we were all trying to do what was best for students. And hearing students was really that kernel of consensus that was able to sort of grow as we worked through a lot of the issues as a team there. And again, you can put it, start time's one of the things right there. I mean, right now in Weston, we are really deep in a morass of negotiations, of contract negotiations. We have a media scheduled for next week, and hopefully we can come to an agreement. But this is new for Weston. This is not like Watertown, where there has been sort of a history of a lot of back and forth. This is new for Weston, and one thing that I've been able to do in negotiations is that we've had some subcommittees. You know, one was working on the supervision and evaluation system. One is working on the stipends that teachers receive for extracurricular activities and how can we make it a little bit more responsive for student choice. And those subcommittees that I'm leading with the union president or his designee, one's the supervision and evaluation I did with the union president, and the one that I'm doing is another member of an appointed member there. We're getting somewhere because we're finding these kernels of common ground in these discussions. And I think that kind of process, when you're listening first and then stating your side and then collectively trying to find that area of consensus, is a really powerful way to try to resolve disagreements and move forward.
Thank you for that.
The next question involves DEI. In Belmont, we are challenged in hiring diversely as well as adequately supporting our students, educators, and community around questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Available survey data and statistics highlight disparities in educational outcomes, especially for our Black and Brown students, as well as mental health challenges, which also affect many LGBTQ+ students, as well as our female students. Please tell us about a time when you have served as an equity leader to improve DEI goals, and how did you communicate your DEI vision to a broader community to accomplish these goals?
So important, this question. And want to acknowledge that I'm answering this question as a person of privilege, as a white male, and respect other perspectives on this, because it's important that many voices, especially from our historically disenfranchised groups, are heard on this subject. When I came from Watertown, which had made a lot of progress on diversity, equity, inclusion, and we were a very diverse school district in the first place, to Weston, which is a more sheltered, homogeneous community, eyes open wide, wow, I'm in a very different place as far as, and so Weston, when I started in Weston 5 years ago, we had not done much work on DEI at all. So we're a little behind Watertown and Belmont, in that manner. And so let me tell you sort of what we have done so far, with DEI, and then I've already had some comments about how we need to work on DEI together and move forward together there in a previous question. So the first thing that we did is that we felt, after looking at the same kind of data that you are, and we identified the exact same issues. So Belmont is certainly not alone, with these gaps, with these issues there, that we needed a DEI director. So one of the first things that we did is we hired a director of what we call in our district a director of equity and professional learning, because we knew that much of the professional learning that we were going to be doing in the next many years would be focused around equity and making sure that we are able to reach and teach all students, to make sure that every student in the district can bring their whole selves to school so that they can learn and thrive every day. So that was sort of the goal that we did. With the DEI director, we quickly instituted a mandated course that all teachers needed to take, because everybody needed to sort of be in the same page in their own equity journey, as far as understanding implicit bias, understanding both interpersonal but also systemic and institutional racism, and also understanding their whiteness. If they're people like me, of privilege, and that whiteness is actually a culture as well. It's not a nothing that is often assumed by many. What we also did is we participated in the Harvard RIDES program, reimagining integration, diverse and equitable schools, I think is what the acronym meant. We had a lot of guidance from Harvard, and one thing that I was able to do is that I experienced the rides in Watertown before I left, so I helped facilitate us pairing up with rides there, and that helped us sort of give us more of a strategic planning process about what we would need to do first, second, third, as we were doing that, and gave us a little bit more of a context of who did we need to involve as far as what kind of stakeholders and what kind of groups that we needed to do. And really building on our strengths, because one thing that we did have in Weston is a very strong METCO program and a very strong Boston METCO PTO there that were partners with us, that worked really, that worked and continue to work very, very closely with us. How do we integrate those really strong organizations in more closely with sort of Weston planning was one of the things that we worked on. And that culminated in our district improvement plan, which you can see on our website. You will see in our district improvement plan that equity is front and center. I mean, there is no ifs, ands, or buts about that, and there was a lot of community stakeholder work to try to bring that together, including our stakeholders from Boston, who were really influential there. And once you have a strategic plan and you have those action plans, those yearly action plans that sort of underlie those strategic plans, then work can get done. So what kind of work has been done since then? Even within the pandemic, as we were, as things get interrupted, as when that happened, we've had really solidified our elementary curriculum so that everyone is receiving a Western education, and it doesn't really depend on which teacher you have. Because what we came to see when we started is that in some very important subjects we did not have a curriculum, and in other important subjects we had sort of a soft guidance curriculum that some teachers followed and other teachers didn't. So one thing that we did is we really made sure that everyone receives a Western education versus education depending on what teacher they have there. Second thing that we did is we focused on responsive classroom. And we adapted a responsive classroom for the high school, and we sort of created a course based on responsive classroom principles called Teaching for Equity and Diversity for high school educators, because responsive classroom as a program is only a K-8 program. That responsive classroom really focuses on social emotional learning, focuses on students' sense of belonging and agency in the classroom. And there are certain teacher practices that really support that, and there are other teachers' practices that really shouldn't happen in the classroom that keep on sort of continuing that inequity, that stratification that sometimes you see in schools and in classrooms. So we did that for 2 years. And this is new for Weston. We actually, in Weston, they didn't have sort of a tradition of sort of sustained professional development. This is not something that was new. So part of it was getting teachers used to, no, it's not going away. We're actually going to continue to do this, and we're actually going to follow up with you in our supervisory, in our coaching conversations with you to see that these practices are happening in the classroom. Yes, you are going to need to run a morning meeting. Yes, that kind of thing that is there. And that was a culture shift in Weston. And then for the last 3 years, we've been focusing on culturally responsive and linguistically responsive teaching practices in the same kind of way. And the way we're doing it is kind of innovative. Each school has its own leadership team that focuses on culturally responsive teaching. The director of equity and I work together to work with the team leaders to sort of say, okay, here's the part of culturally responsive teaching we want to cover. We brainstorm together how we're going to deliver the professional development to teachers, and we allow different schools, because again, maybe something is much more important at the elementary level than the high school, or vice versa. We allow sort of teacher teams to tailor the presentation to their groups. And it's really what teachers receive is professional development from their colleagues, not from an administrator, not from an expert from outside the district, from their colleagues about the kinds of teaching practices that we are emphasizing. And they work together in developing goals for themselves and for their teams as far as what culturally responsive classrooms they want to focus on as they go. It's been really successful, and we've come a long way changing instructional practice so that more kids' voices are heard. The next step, because we're wrapping up with culturally responsive teaching, is universal design for learning, which is another very powerful way of really meeting students where they're at and making sure that their needs are being met, often by providing voice and choice in not only what they're learning, but how they're learning and how they are demonstrating their learning to their teachers.
Can I ask you just to speak briefly about your approach to assessing progress against?
I'm sorry, Mike, the time has gotten
Okay.
more than an hour, so I'm just going to have to ask you to hold that one. I apologize for that.
I'm sorry, I get long-winded, especially when you talk about teaching and learning. It's really great.
No problem. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. So as I said at the beginning, if you have a question for the school committee that you would like to ask, please do. Don't feel any pressure.
Yeah. So one thing I've heard in my conversations today, and really I appreciate the honesty and as far as what we do. It started right at the very beginning when I was at central office. There's some important issues that were raised in this interview as far as how do we bring special education students in the district? How do we manage a very, very tight budget? A lot of those things. So one of the things that I do know is that Belmont has a whole lot of strengths. And a great way to solve problems is to leverage the strengths that you have so that you can address, the issues that are at hand. So thinking about Belmont in terms of what strengths to leverage, what might be some things that we can do, as far as that whole thing is concerned. Specifically, what strengths do you think might be the most leverageable as we are facing some of these problems that we've been talking about?
Thank you for the question. I will provide a brief answer, and then if anybody else would like to follow up, please do. That's a great question, first of all, so thank you for it. And I think that the greatest strength that Belmont Public Schools could leverage would be a little bit back to my question for you today, but it's our community. I think that our strength is a community that is supportive of our schools. We also have tremendous strength amongst organized groups that do fundraising for our schools and support our schools, but we also have many parents and community members who are always ready to reach out, whether it's helping us around transportation and busing, or something bigger than that in our schools. But I think that is an area that we could even do a better job at, would be leveraging individuals as well as groups in our community to help support our students in our schools. And if anybody else would like to contribute to that, please do.
I would just add, we've got an amazing educators. I think the example that you gave about the budget and how you can work with the educators that you have to solve some creative problems, I think that's definitely leverageable. Obviously, they had to do a lot with very little, and that just speaks to how, the power of the educators that we have. So I think that's a definite strength.
Thank you.
I think in addition, it's a very unique time in this district, given the reconfiguration and all of the opportunities that both the space and the different school, I guess, age groups and culture building within those schools, and really thinking about what works best in the new reconfiguration to support students is another. I would just say maybe it's a strength. Strength may not be the right word, but it's a very positive aspect of this particular moment in time in terms of thinking about new leadership coming into the district.
Thank you. Yeah.
Dr. Carter, I'm sure you know this after having spent some time in Belmont High School today, but I think it's worth saying that our students are one of our great strengths, not only in terms of their desire to learn, their capacity to learn, their passion, et cetera, but also because they are a source of information about what is and is not working, what is and is not needed, and ultimately why we have public schools at all in our town. So I cite them as a source of great strength as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So thank you. Thank you for helping us to also end on such a positive note. I hope everybody can see that the school committee really does feel like we have a lot of strengths, and we're very thankful for them. So if you could just wrap up in 2 to 3 minutes and tell us why you feel that you would be a good fit for the next superintendent of the Belmont Public Schools.
Well, that's sort of a mutual decision, right? As far as how we go. But let me tell you a little bit about myself and my background. First and foremost, I'm a Belmont resident. I lived in Belmont since 1995. My kids were born and raised in Belmont. My kids went to Cambridge Friends for elementary, but they also then they went to the public schools, Chenery and Belmont High School. My oldest graduated 8 years ago. My youngest graduated 4 years ago. And it's amazing now that how they are starting their adult lives, how the Belmont Public Schools really influenced them in a lot of different ways that are surprising there. And really grateful for their experience. They didn't have an easy road. Some of, especially one of my children didn't have an easy road. But the outcomes are, at least there's a sample of 2 of outcomes that have been, absolutely terrific. I'm not sure if being a community member is like a part of the fit or not, but I think it's something to consider. There. I don't think it's I think we sort of need to keep that in perspective. I think there's, you could come from outside the community and do a very good job as well. I have a wealth of administrative experience, first at the school level and then at the district level. I've been very successful in both being a principal in Watertown and then being as assistant superintendent in Weston. I am ready to be a superintendent. This is the time and stage of my career where it's time to take on that leadership role. It's been a goal of mine ever since I received my my EDD back in 2016 when I went to Boston College and got my EDD in educational administration, and it certainly was a superintendent preparation program. I've learned a lot. I've been fortunate to work with many many colleagues and mentors, and I think the diversity of my experience working in Massachusetts and really being that spark to really generate school-wide improvement as a principal and district-wide improvement in Belmont, in Weston, I think would speak to me as far as being able to do the same in Weston with a team in a collaborative way, listening to stakeholders, and making sure that all concerns and ideas, because often the ideas come from very interesting places, are heard and responded to. I'm a very upbeat, positive person. I like to be in schools. I'm a very visible. I will be very visible as superintendent. I don't really like to hide in the office as much as some of my counterparts do. I enjoy making connections and developing strong, close relationships. Very transparent person. I sort of tell it like it is. And I'm just sort of telling you sort of what my leadership style is to see if there is a fit there. I believe that from my end, I see so much potential with Belmont, particularly with the reconfiguration, as you were saying, to really think about, okay, so we have an innovative building, because really there is so much space for innovation, for kids to collaborate, for teachers to do things differently in what will be that 7 to 12 building. And then that opportunity to reimagine Chenery as an upper elementary school and reimagine the elementary schools as lower elementary schools is as exciting an opportunity as there is that really is hard to pass up. Because if we can't, we have a real potential for some really innovative work as far as helping all students reach their potential in Belmont in this window of time, which is really filled with possibilities. And so excited. I was so grateful of my tour. Every meeting, my excitement level and my enthusiasm is getting higher and higher. And so emotionally I feel a fit, but I think it's also important that that you really consider the fit as well, and see if we can be, we can work in partnership. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. So in just a moment, I'm going to actually adjourn the school committee meeting, because then we will have a separate meeting for the forum. So we look forward to seeing you back so that you can answer some questions from the community at 6 o'clock. And
Okay.
so after I adjourn, we'll take you over, so you have some time to yourself. I know it's been a
right.
really long day for you, so
you.
appreciate it. Could I get a motion to adjourn the school committee meeting?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.